Yeah, Abu Bakr.
And the book calls it his father.
His father-in-law. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So I just
I
want
get
to
it
know
mixed
which
up.
one it
Actually, it was
was.
his wife's father. It was his wife's father. Yeah, Abu Bakr.
Yeah, so his father.
Yeah, his father-in-law. Yes, I
got
did
that
say
clear.
uncle. I know. All right.
Okay.
Not that it's going to make that big of a difference.
Yeah, but I wanted to
But
make sure.
basically, yeah.
If it had came up as a question, I wanted to make sure I had.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions or comments? All right, today we'll go over Africa and then the test will be Wednesday, and then I'll start preparing for the next pass. All right. I'll get started. We have had 2 of your classmates drop, and surprise of surprises, one of them had a 99 average. that happens a lot of times. That happens. But anyway, all right, I'll be quiet. All right, Africa. I studied African history on my own a little bit some 40 years ago, but the way they're teaching it now is a lot different, and we have learned a whole lot more about Africa. They did have a history. At one time we thought they didn't, that they were just the people sitting there with no history. They do have a history, did have. And they figured out more in the world, and this is the one thing that we get from this lesson. They were more involved in world affairs than we realize. Africa is the most mineral-rich continent on the face of the earth, rich in minerals such as iron and tin, gold and diamonds, and a lot of these minerals found their way north into Europe and east into the Far East, China, India, and Malaysia. What is today Indonesia? In other words, Africa, the people there initially were not primitive people. They were highly advanced. They lived in large cities, and they had nations. And they had trade. Now, if Sir Lancelot ever existed, if you may know, Sir Lancelot was one of Arthur's chief knights. If he ever existed at all, the armor he wore might very well have come from Africa. The iron that was used to make up his armor and sword, because Africans were not only miners, they were smelters. In other words, could smelt the iron and ship it abroad. In fact, a lot of persons say that Africa led the way to civilization. Now, the standard view of where humanity came from is humanity originated here in the Kenya region of Africa, in East Africa, and slowly spread from Kenya all over the globe. This is standard that the original humans were in fact Africans. And then humanity slowly made its way all across the globe from this part of the world. It is also believed that they were the world's first farmers, having learned that certain kinds of plants could be cultivated, and they would grow far better cultivated than they would grow in the wild. And certain plants, you could mix one plant with another, or breed one plant with another. Now, don't get me wrong, you cannot breed apples with oranges, but you could breed certain varieties of apples and get a better apple, or mix varieties of the various plants and get better. And that they taught the rest of the world how to farm, because they were the world's first farmers and possibly the world's first workmen. Geography is a big factor in history, and so we'll go from here to Africa's geography. Africa is separated from the rest of the world by the world's largest desert, the Sahara. The Sahara Desert is actually now much bigger than the United States, and it's been getting bigger and bigger all the time. But the world's hottest temperatures are recorded here. It has been known for the temperature to get up to 170 degrees, and that's even hotter than the interior of your car on a summer day when it's sat outside all day long. You get in a hot car, it's not quite as hot as the Sahara Desert. It's the hot part of the day. Anyway, the Sahara dried up some millennia ago, and it separated this part of Africa from the rest of humanity. And Africa, like the Indians in North and South America, became somewhat isolated from the rest of humanity, even though they were not as isolated as were the Indians. Now, the Sahara Desert was not always a desert. At one time, it appears to have been a really fertile grassland, probably might call it savanna. And in fact, during the last ice age, when the ice sheet came down and covered much of Europe and North America as far south as the Great Lakes, actually as far south as the state of Ohio, the Ohio River, and covered just about all of Europe, including Italy and the northern Mediterranean. In fact, it got so cold that the Mediterranean Sea actually is believed to have frozen over. Humanity migrated down into Africa and settled in what is today the Sahara Desert, which was then habitable. And they left a lot of their artwork, a lot of their sculpture, a lot of their paintings, rock paintings. Your book shows a picture of a rock painting. A lot of their artwork was left behind in the Sahara when the Sahara dried up. Now, there are various theories as to what caused the Sahara Desert to dry up. One theory was that the people used too much irrigation, and the water they irrigated their crops with had salt in it. After years and years of irrigating their crops with salt water, or it was low-level salt. But if you know anything about chemistry, when you have salt water and the water evaporates, what happens to the salt?
It goes into the ground.
What?
It would go into the ground.
You go to the ground, stay behind. And after a time, this salt killed the plant life. When the sun shone down on this brown desert, it heated up the desert. And the heat forced all your winds, the rain clouds, away from this area. And then it got hotter and hotter, which made for fewer and fewer rain clouds, which made it hotter, which made for fewer rain. Just a vicious cycle, one factor working against another, until eventually the Sahara Desert became nothing but a huge sandy area that was very difficult to get across. Now, at first, there were persons, there have been persons who crossed it all down through the ages, and in fact, a big part of our history is to try to figure out where they crossed and how. And I had a student ask me one time, why doesn't the map show them taking straight lines to go across the desert? The answer is they had to find an oasis or a river and follow the oasis and go where the oasis went. So at first they used donkeys to get across the desert, but then they found out that the camel was better because a camel could go for days and maybe even weeks on end without drinking water. So they would load down their camels and carry their goods across the desert. The camel also, it does not hurt when the sandstorms come up. The sandstorms are really wicked blast of sand that can blind a person or make a person really, really miserable. Well, the camel eye is somewhat immune to that. So, anyway, the desert has kept on getting larger and larger, and nobody knows how long that trend will continue. As a side note, this is hurricane season, and it's now believed that most of our hurricanes originate right here in the Sahara Desert. Just one little puff of wind will join with another puff and join with another puff and head out the Atlantic, where the warm waters of the Atlantic will add energy to the wind, and the winds would eventually form a depression, then a hurricane. Well, a depression first, then a storm, and finally a hurricane. And these hurricanes have a tendency to eventually curve north. So far this year, every hurricane that has happened in the Atlantic has curved to the north and missed us. But they have their origin right here in the Sahara Desert. Anyway, as the Sahara Desert dried up, humanity had to leave it, except for a few who stayed behind in the oasis and along the banks of what few rivers there are. There's the Niger River right here that goes through the desert, and of course on the east is the Nile River that we already talked about. Otherwise, there are very, very few dead rivers here, very few lakes, very few oases. It's mostly just mile after endless mile of sand. And they have to navigate on the desert like they do in the ocean. They can't navigate by landscape because the mountains, the amount of sand will be here this year, and then when we come back, it is shifted. Shifting sands means that they cannot navigate except by stars or by sun, or in modern times by compass. Anyway, by reconstructing the trails that they used, we have begun to reconstruct Africa's history. Now, some of the nations that formed, the first nation we talk about that seems to have formed in Africa was the land of Nubia. Nubia was right here between what is today Egypt and the Sudan, to the south of Egypt. And there are persons who have said that perhaps Nubia actually formed before Egypt. It is known that the Nubians and Egyptians had contact with each other, traded, and exchanged their ideas with each other. The Nubians had writing. We have found some of their inscriptions, but unfortunately, this is a case of a whole lot of ancient writing. There's not enough for us to decipher. We cannot yet read it. It is known that Nubia fought a war against Assyria, which we mentioned before. Speaking of Nubia, if any of you ever watched the original Star Trek series, there was one show where the communications officer on the Enterprise was once called a Nubian by one of the aliens Captain Kirk met. A few of you might know what I'm talking about. But you know, the word Nubia, or the name Nubia, did appear in one of the Star Trek movies. The Nubians were probably black. And it is believed that at one point, one of the Egyptian dynasties might have been Nubian. The Nubian dynasty might have gone and conquered Egypt and occupied Egypt's throne for a while and took the title of Pharaoh.